Welcome, everyone, to Silas Grave Stories, where I share the kind of tales that might just make you double check the shadows around you. Before we get started, don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more stories that will stick with you long after they're over. And hey, quick question. What time is it where you are right now? Let me know in the comments. I'd love to see how many of you are listening in the dead of night. All right, let's get into tonight's story. It was around midnight when I first heard it, soft thuds, like something tapping against the walls. At first, I dismissed it, telling myself it was just the house settling. But then the sound started to get louder. The rhythm was off, like someone was knocking, but not on the door. It was coming from somewhere deeper inside, like it was coming from the very walls themselves. I stopped what I was doing and listened, my heart beating faster. The noise continued, faint but clear, echoing through the quiet house. There was no wind to be heard outside, no traffic or noise from the street, just silence. And the thudding sound. The sound seemed to move around the house, shifting from one side to another. It wasn't random, someone or something was making it intentionally. The idea made me uneasy. I walked slowly to the window and peeked through the blinds. My eyes scanned the yard, half expecting to see an animal or a branch swaying in the breeze. But nothing moved. For a moment I thought the sound had stopped. Maybe it was just my imagination. But then I saw something. A figure. A person, standing motionless in the middle of my front yard. The moonlight illuminated just enough for me to make out their shape. A tall silhouette, their face obscured in shadow beneath the hood of a dark jacket. I stood frozen, my hand still gripping the blinds. I blinked, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Who was this? It couldn't be anyone I knew. It was far too late for anyone to be outside, especially on a quiet street like mine. My heart rate quickened as I stepped back, my breath growing shallow. The figure didn't move. They just stood there, still as a statue, staring. Or at least I imagined they were staring. I couldn't see their eyes from this distance. The unease that had been building in me turned to fear. My mind raced through every possible explanation. Maybe it was just a neighbor or someone lost. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I turned quickly and grabbed my phone, my hands trembling slightly. I dialed the number for the police, but hesitated before pressing the call button. What was I going to tell them? That a stranger was standing in my yard in the middle of the night. Maybe they would just laugh at me, think I was overreacting. Still, I couldn't shake the fear that had taken root in me. The figure didn't move, didn't speak, and I couldn't help but feel they knew I was watching. The tapping noise resumed again, but this time it was louder. It sounded closer, almost like it was coming from the back of the house. I turned away from the window and moved quickly to check the back door, but nothing seemed out of place. Then, just as I was about to turn back to the front window, the figure moved. Slowly, deliberately, they began walking toward the house. I felt my breath catch in my throat. My heart pounded as I stepped back from the window. Who was this person, and why were they outside my home at this hour? There was no reason for anyone to be here, not at midnight. I took a step toward the hallway, my eyes darting back to the front yard. The figure was still moving, getting closer to the door. Each step they took seemed to echo in my ears. It was as if the house itself had gone completely silent, every other noise drowned out by the relentless thudding of my heartbeat. I backed away, trying to keep calm, trying to think logically. I considered calling again, but my phone sat heavy in my hand as if I could feel the weight of my indecision. There was a sudden, sharp noise, a door creaking. It came from behind me, from the back of the house. I spun around in shock, expecting to see the person there. But when I glanced down the hallway, the door was still closed. The house felt too still, too quiet. I took a slow breath, trying to steady myself, but something about the silence made everything feel worse. I was alone in a house that suddenly felt far too big. I walked cautiously toward the back door, checking every corner as I went. But nothing was out of place. No one was there. No sign that anyone had entered the house. I let out a breath I didn't realize I had been holding. Maybe it was all just my mind playing tricks on me. Maybe I was overreacting to the shadows outside. But then I heard it again, the faint tapping. This time it was right outside the door. I froze. I slowly approached the back door and peered through the small window next to it. There was nothing out there. No shadow, no figure. The yard was empty. I pulled back, but the tapping continued. And then I heard something else. A soft, dragging sound. My mind raced as I turned back to the front window. I had to know if the figure was still there, if they had moved, or if they were still standing motionless in the yard. I pulled back the blinds again. The yard was still empty. The person was gone. I stood there for a moment, unsure if I had just imagined it all. Maybe I had fallen asleep on the couch and was only dreaming, but the fear gripping my chest told me otherwise. My hands were cold and my heart was still racing. I took a few steps back from the window and glanced over my shoulder, expecting to see the back door just as I had left it. But instead, my gaze was drawn to the reflection in the glass. It was subtle at first, a faint movement behind me, something I hadn't noticed before, a shadow stretching across the hallway. I turned around quickly, but nothing was there. The hallway was empty, just like before. I felt my pulse pounding in my neck. My breath came quicker. My feet moved on their own as I stepped closer to the hallway, my eyes darting between the living room and the dark corridor ahead of me. Every shadow felt like a hidden presence, watching, waiting. The tapping sound had stopped, but the silence was worse than any noise. The house felt off, like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I moved into the hallway, my eyes still flicking back to the reflection in the living room. There it was again, a figure in the glass. For a split second I thought it was me, but then I realized. The figure in the reflection wasn't moving like I was. It was standing still, facing the same direction as me, but eerily still. My heart skipped a beat. I spun around, but once again the hallway was empty. What was happening? Was this some kind of sick joke? The fear gnawed at my insides and I felt like I was losing control. I stepped cautiously toward the front door. The lock was still secure, but something inside me told me to double-check. The house felt too quiet. The longer I stood there, the more unsettled I became. Then, as I reached for the door handle, I heard a faint sound from behind me. A low, barely audible whisper. The whisper sent a chill up my spine, so cold and unnatural I could feel it in the air around me. My fingers went numb on the door handle, and for a moment I froze. The whisper was so quiet I thought I might have imagined it. But then it came again, closer this time. It wasn't words, just a breath, a sound like someone was trying to speak without making a sound, but it was there. I turned quickly, my eyes scanning the hallway behind me. Nothing. I stepped away from the door, my senses on high alert. Every creak of the floorboards felt like someone was walking right behind me. Every shadow looked like it could hold something waiting to pounce. I couldn't explain it. I didn't know who or what was out there, but I had a horrible feeling that whatever it wasn't going away. The whisper came again, but this time I couldn't ignore it. It was louder, clearer, and it was coming from somewhere inside the house, not outside like I had hoped. I stood frozen in place, trying to pinpoint the direction. It sounded like it was coming from the living room, but as I moved closer to the doorway, the whisper stopped. I couldn't move. Every muscle in my body was tense. My breath hitched in my throat and I waited. Nothing. I walked slowly into the living room, my heart pounding louder in my ears with every step. The lights were off, but the moonlight streaming through the windows gave just enough illumination. The shadows felt heavier, darker. I turned around to check the door once more. Maybe I had missed something. But as I did, my eyes caught the reflection in the window, and there it was again, the same figure, standing just behind me. I jerked around, panic flooding my chest, but the living room was empty. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over the coffee table. There was no one here. There couldn't be. Yet, the reflection was still there, frozen in place. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to leave. I grabbed my phone, quickly dialing the police. I needed help, and I needed it now. My hands shook as I held the phone to my ear, waiting for someone to pick up. But before anyone could answer, I heard the whisper again, closer, right behind me. My heart stopped. I spun around, but this time I wasn't alone. The figure stood only inches away from me. My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment I couldn't move. I couldn't think. The person was tall, dressed in dark, tattered clothes, their face hidden by a deep hood. I couldn't see their eyes, but the sense of dread that washed over me was enough to make my legs feel like they were turning to stone. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The stranger didn't move. They stood there, silent, as if waiting for something. I couldn't breathe. My pulse hammered in my ears, each beat louder than the last. My mind raced. Who was this person? Why were they here? Was this some kind of robbery? Or something worse? I took a step back, but the figure stepped forward, their presence like a weight pressing down on me. I don't know you, I managed to whisper, my voice shaking. The stranger didn't respond. They just stood there, their body stiff, unmoving, as though they were made of stone. But their presence, it felt real, inescapable. And the fear wrapped itself around me, choking me, making it harder to think clearly. I didn't know what to do. Should I run? Should I fight back? But the stranger hadn't done anything yet. They hadn't moved, just stood silently in front of me, watching. I looked back at my phone. I had almost forgotten I was still holding it. I quickly pressed the emergency button. The dial tone echoed in my ear, and my hand felt weak, trembling. Then, as if responding to the sound, the figure shifted. Slowly, deliberately, they raised one hand, pointing directly at me. The world seemed to freeze. My breath caught in my throat. The chill in the room deepened, and I felt as though the very air was growing heavier. I tried to back away again, but the stranger's finger never left me. It was as if they were anchoring me in place, forcing me to stay. And then the whisper came again, but this time it wasn't just a sound. It was a voice, low, guttural, unnatural. Leave, now. The voice sent a shiver down my spine. It wasn't a normal voice. It was deep, almost raspy, like it came from somewhere far away or from inside the walls themselves. It didn't sound human, and it didn't feel real. It was a command, a warning that carried with it an air of finality. Leave, now. I couldn't move. I wanted to run, to scream, but the words of the stranger paralyzed me, locking me in place. The figure's hand was still raised, pointing directly at me, and I couldn't look away from their unmoving face. The shadows in the room seemed to deepen, stretching longer, more sinister, as if the figure itself was pulling the darkness around it. My heart pounded so loudly in my chest, I could hardly hear anything else. I tried to speak, to ask what they wanted, but my throat felt dry, the words stuck somewhere between panic and disbelief. "Who are you?" I managed to force out, my voice barely more than a whisper. The figure didn't respond. They just stood there, still and silent, their hand never lowering. The air felt thick, suffocating, and every breath I took seemed harder than the last. I felt trapped in this nightmare, alone in my own house with an intruder whose intentions I couldn't begin to understand. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. The fear was too overwhelming. There was something about this figure, something about the way they stood in my house, that told me I was in grave danger. I had to get out. But how? How could I escape when I couldn't even move? The whisper came again, this time louder, more forceful. Leave or suffer the consequences. The warning sent a jolt of adrenaline through my body. I could feel the blood rushing in my ears, my hands trembling as I finally found my legs again. I turned and bolted for the door. My body was shaking, and I couldn't stop myself from running, even though I had no idea where I was going. I couldn't think, couldn't focus on anything except the need to get away. But as I reached for the door, I heard the footsteps, heavy, slow, each step deliberate, coming closer. I whirled around, expecting to see the figure behind me, but the hallway was empty. I hesitated for a split second, my mind racing. Had they gone? Were they waiting for me to make a mistake? I had no idea what was real anymore, no idea what was happening to me. I grabbed the door handle and pulled, but it wouldn't budge. Locked. The panic surged again. I turned and ran to the back of the house, but every door I reached was locked. Every window. I was trapped. I could hear the footsteps growing louder, closing in on me. The heavy, dragging steps echoed through the house as if the figure was right behind me. I ran into the kitchen, my hands desperately searching for something, anything, to defend myself. But everything was silent, as if the house itself was holding its breath. Then I heard it. The door creaked open. I turned, and there, standing in the doorway, was the figure once again. They stepped inside, their movements slow and methodical, as if they had all the time in the world. The cold air in the room seemed to drop even lower. The shadows stretched further, darker, and the fear wrapped around my throat like a vice. "No!" I shouted, backing away, my feet stumbling over the floor. The figure didn't respond. They didn't need to. They simply walked forward, their presence filling the room with a suffocating pressure. Each step they took seemed to echo like a drumbeat, marking the slow march toward something terrible. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I was frozen in place, unable to escape, unable to fight back. "Why?" I managed to choke out. "Why are you doing this?" The figure tilted their head slightly, as if considering my question. Then, without a word, they reached up and pulled back their hood. For the first time, I saw their face. It was pale, too pale, with hollow eyes that stared into mine with an unnatural intensity. Their skin seemed stretched tight, almost sickly. But the worst part was the mouth, a twisted, jagged smile that was far too wide, stretching unnaturally across their face. "You know me," the figure rasped. I stared, my mind racing, trying to make sense of the words. "What do you mean?" The smile grew wider, the figure's lips stretching further across their face. "You invited me in." I didn't know what they meant. I hadn't invited anyone into my house. No one had come in except for the stranger standing in front of me now, with that terrible, twisted grin. I felt my throat tighten as panic washed over me. My vision blurred, my legs growing weaker with each passing second. "I didn't invite you," I whispered, but the words sounded weak, hollow. I knew it wasn't true, that something was wrong, something much bigger than I could understand. The figure tilted its head even further, a strange, almost mocking gesture. "Yes, you did. You just don't remember." I shook my head in confusion. This couldn't be happening. How was this possible? The stranger standing before me didn't look human. They didn't even feel real. The figure took another step forward, and this time I didn't move. I couldn't. It was like my legs had turned to stone. The cold air in the room seemed to suffocate me. The figure reached out with a bony hand and placed it on my shoulder. I flinched, but I couldn't pull away. "You called me," the figure whispered. "A long time ago." I could feel my heart pounding, each beat echoing in my ears as I tried to process what it was saying. I never called you," I stammered. "I don't know you." The figure smiled again, but this time it was a cruel, knowing smile. "You did. You always have." I felt a wave of dizziness wash over me, and my vision blurred once more. The room seemed to spin, and I stumbled, unable to keep my balance. I reached out for the counter to steady myself, but I felt nothing beneath my hand, nothing at all. The house was different. The shadows had deepened, and the silence was oppressive. I felt the weight of the figure's presence all around me, like it was pressing in from every corner, suffocating me. "You called me," the figure repeated, its voice no longer distant or ethereal. It was here. It was now. "You wished for me to come." I didn't understand. None of this made sense, and then it hit me. The dreams, the strange feelings, the whispers that had followed me for months. I had dismissed them as nightmares, as nothing more than anxiety, but they hadn't been just dreams. They had been something else, something real. I had been calling them, and now they were here. I felt the weight of the figure's hand on my shoulder, cold and unnervingly still. It wasn't just a touch, it was a mark, an imprint. It was as if something deep inside me had finally clicked into place, something I had tried to ignore for so long. The dreams, the whispers in the night, the moments where I would wake up in a cold sweat, feeling as though someone was standing just at the edge of my bed watching me. The strange, fleeting sensations that had haunted me for months, the thoughts that I tried so hard to suppress. Now they were here, standing in front of me in the form of this person, or whatever this thing was. "You've been calling me," the figure repeated, its voice now a low rasp, almost purring as though savoring the moment. "And now I'm here." The coldness in the room seemed to deepen with each word. It was as if the walls themselves were closing in, trapping me with this presence that I couldn't comprehend. I tried to pull away, but the figure's grip was like iron, unyielding. I could feel the weight of their presence, pressing against me, suffocating me, like the very air in the house was turning into stone. I opened my mouth to protest, to ask what it wanted from me, but the words stuck in my throat. The realization hit me like a punch to the stomach. The figure wasn't just here because of a random chance. They were here because I had invited them, whether I remembered it or not. I had made a mistake, a terrible mistake. The whispers, the strange feeling that someone had been watching me. I had felt it even before the figure appeared. Something had been drawing me in, a force I didn't understand, pulling me toward the darkness. "No," I whispered, backing away. I never called for you." The figure's smile widened, impossibly wide, stretching across its face in a grotesque mockery of human expression. It leaned in closer, and the coldness intensified. "You did," it said softly, its breath like ice on my skin. "You just didn't know what you were asking for." Suddenly, the air in the room seemed to warp. The shadows that had been cast by the dim light from the kitchen began to move, writhing like tendrils, reaching toward me, swirling in patterns that made no sense. The walls themselves seemed to bend, stretching and shifting as though the house was alive, reacting to the figure's presence. I staggered backward, trying to escape, but I was trapped in the nightmare that had come alive around me. The figure began to move toward me again, its slow, deliberate steps echoing in the silence of the room. Its hollow eyes locked onto mine, and I felt like I was being pulled deeper into its gaze, as if I couldn't look away even if I tried. "What? What do you want?" I asked, my voice barely more than a broken whisper. My chest tightened and I could feel the overwhelming weight of the fear crushing me. I had no idea what this thing was, but it was far beyond anything I had ever known. "You know what I want," it replied softly, almost coaxingly. "I've always known you were the one." I shook my head violently. "I don't understand. I didn't summon you." The figure's smile grew even wider, and the shadows around it seemed to pulse with a life of their own. "You did, whether you realize it or not. You were always drawn to the darkness. The things you called out for, the things you hid from the world, they made you easy to find." I backed up even further, my heart pounding in my chest as my eyes darted around the room. I needed to get out. I needed to run, to find a way out of this suffocating nightmare. But every exit, every window, every door, everything was blocked, sealed shut by the dark force that seemed to control the house. "What do you mean?" I asked, struggling to keep my voice steady despite the terror that gripped me. "What have I done?" The figure's laugh was soft, low, like a breeze brushing through dry leaves. "You called for something greater than yourself, something beyond this world, and now you must pay the price." It raised its hand, and suddenly I felt a sharp pull in the pit of my stomach, as if something deep inside me was being torn away. The figure's eyes burned into mine, and the air around me grew colder, heavier. I didn't know." I gasped, stumbling back against the kitchen counter. Please, I didn't mean it. I didn't want this. The figure tilted its head, its smile twisting further, almost stretching across its entire face. It's too late for apologies. There are no second chances here. You have already called me into your world, and now you must accept the consequences. With a quick motion, the figure extended its arm, pointing directly at me. The shadows around the room seemed to twist and bend as if they were alive, as though they were reaching out to pull me in. The temperature in the room dropped sharply, and I could see my breath fogging in front of me. I reached out in desperation, grabbing anything I could find to steady myself, but the shadows continued to rise, coiling around my feet like serpents. I could feel them now, pulling me, tugging me toward the figure. My limbs felt heavier with each passing second. I was being drawn into the darkness, into the void. No, please, I screamed, but it was no use. The figure's hand was like a weight, dragging me closer to it. I felt my body giving in to the pull, my feet lifting from the ground. The figure's voice came again, softer now, almost soothing. You invited me here, and now I will take what is mine. And in that moment, everything went black. I awoke with a start, gasping for air. My body was covered in a cold sweat, and my heart pounded in my chest as though I had just run a marathon. I sat up, looking around the room. It was silent, too silent. I was back in my house. Everything appeared normal, as if the events of the past few moments were nothing more than a bad dream. But I knew better. I could still feel the lingering coldness in the air, the oppressive weight of the figure's presence that had never truly left. I stood slowly, my legs trembling, and made my way toward the door. I needed to leave. I needed to escape, but as I reached for the doorknob, I stopped. The figure was there, standing in the doorway. This time, it wasn't as imposing. The shadows no longer wrapped around it, and the coldness had diminished. It wasn't standing as it had before, tall and menacing. Instead, it was seated in the corner of the room, its gaze fixed on me. You didn't leave, I whispered. The figure didn't answer, but it didn't need to. The house was now different. The darkness had spread, creeping into every corner, every crevice, and I knew deep down that there was no running anymore. You made a bargain, the figure finally said, its voice no longer threatening but strangely calm. You called me into your world, and I have come, just as you wanted. The figure sat in the corner, watching me, its hollow eyes never leaving my face. The calmness of its presence, compared to the storm of terror I felt inside, made my stomach turn. I felt like I was trapped inside a cage, surrounded by thick walls of cold air and shadows that seemed to pulse with life. You don't understand, I whispered, my voice hoarse and strained. I didn't want any of this. I didn't mean to summon you. The figure tilted its head slightly, the corners of its wide smile twitching as if amused by my desperation. You did not summon me by accident. You invited me here. In every thought, every wish, every time you felt lost and called out for something more. I backed away, my mind racing, trying to come up with a way out, but there was no escape. I had no weapons, no tricks, nothing but my fear and confusion. The shadows in the room shifted, slowly closing in, and I realized with growing horror that they were no longer just shadows. They were alive, sentient, swirling like dark tendrils that could reach out at any moment. I turned to face the figure, the one thing I could focus on. What do you want from me? What is this price you keep talking about? I demanded, trying to keep my voice steady, but it trembled. The figure's expression softened slightly, though its grin remained. The price is simple. The darkness you have called, it has a place here now, a place within you, a place that will never leave. In return, you will never be truly alone again. The words hit me like a punch in the gut. The price wasn't some grand exchange. It was something far worse. It was a part of me that would never be free, never be rid of the entity I had invited into my world. It wasn't just a one-time mistake. It was permanent. I turned, my breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. The door, the windows, Everything around me felt suffocating, like there was no room to breathe, no room to think. The house was alive, pressing in from all sides. The shadows were closing in faster now, and the figure's voice floated behind me like a whisper. "You will carry me with you," it said. "Wherever you go, I will be there. You will never be able to escape me." I ran toward the door again, my hands scrambling at the knob, but this time it didn't even turn. It was as though the door had been sealed shut with something stronger than just wood and metal. The air grew colder, more oppressive. "Why are you doing this?" I shouted, turning to face the figure once again. I was panicking now, desperate for any sign that there was a way out of this madness. The figure's smile faded just slightly, the atmosphere in the room growing heavier. "Because it's what you wanted," it said. "It's what you needed. You've always been looking for something more, something you couldn't explain. I am the answer." I didn't know what to believe anymore. Was this real? Was I losing my mind? But deep down I knew this wasn't just a nightmare. This was something real, something that had crossed over into my world. "I won't accept this," I said, shaking my head. "I won't let you control me." The figure's gaze hardened. "You don't have a choice. You made your decision the moment you called for me. You made the bargain, and now you will fulfill it." Suddenly, I felt a sharp pain, deep in my chest. I gasped and staggered back, clutching at my shirt as though it could somehow ease the pressure that was building inside me. "You can't just leave me here," I gasped, my words shaky, trembling. "I didn't ask for this. I didn't know what I was doing." The figure slowly rose from its seated position, its presence filling the room again. "The price has been paid, and there's no going back. You invited me in, and now I will stay." The shadows, which had once only been dark and menacing, now seemed to envelop me, sliding under my skin, twisting through my veins like ice. I tried to scream, but my voice was lost in the growing darkness. My chest tightened, and it felt as though something was crawling inside of me, something cold, something otherworldly. "You are mine now," the figure's voice echoed, and this time it was no longer just a whisper. It was a command. The pain grew more intense, sharper, and I stumbled to my knees, the world spinning around me. Every inch of my body felt like it was being torn apart and reassembled, like I was no longer myself but something else. "No," I gasped, barely able to speak. "No, please." But there was no mercy, no escape, and then everything went dark. When I awoke again, the room was silent. The oppressive coldness that had consumed me was gone, and the house, though still eerily quiet, felt oddly still, calm, almost peaceful. I wasn't sure how long I had been unconscious. Hours? Minutes? I couldn't tell. The strange feeling that had plagued me since the figure first appeared was still there, lingering at the edges of my thoughts. I could still feel the cold presence, but it wasn't as overwhelming as before. I stood up slowly, my legs unsteady as I tried to make sense of everything. My breath fogged in front of me, and I reached for the light switch, flicking it on. The room illuminated, and for a moment everything looked normal. But I knew it wasn't. I could still feel it. The presence of the figure, though it was no longer standing before me, had somehow woven itself into the very fabric of the house. I could feel it in the air, in the corners of the room. It was like an eternal shadow, always just out of sight, always with me. And that was when I realized the price wasn't just the physical pain I had endured. It was my soul, my sense of self. The darkness was inside me now, a part of me that I would never be able to escape. No matter how far I ran, no matter how much time passed, it would follow. It was with me. I had called it, invited it into my life, and now it was here to stay. The bargain had been struck, and there was no undoing it. The figure's voice echoed in my mind once more, a whisper that sent a chill down my spine. "You will never be alone again." I looked at my reflection in the dark window, my own eyes staring back at me. But there was something different about them. A shadow, just behind them, seemed to flicker in and out of existence. I wasn't alone anymore. The days went by, and I tried to convince myself that it was over, that I had somehow survived the encounter. I even convinced myself that it was nothing more than a terrible nightmare, a series of hallucinations, a trick of the mind. But the presence was always there, lurking just beyond the surface of reality, always watching, always waiting. It was never gone. Sometimes, late at night when the house was quiet and the shadows seemed to stretch longer than usual, I would hear it, the whisper, soft and chilling, just out of reach. A reminder that the darkness had found its place within me, and it would never leave.